Okay, welcome everybody back to our text study. Today we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 11. We're going to start with verse 27. And then we're going to finish one story in chapter 11 and move to a second story in chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. So, if you would like to join us in our discussion on Wednesday evening, February 3rd at 7 p.m. Pacific time, you can write to us and we'll be happy to send you the Zoom link. All right, so here's our schedule. Today we're going to, like I say, finish up the chapter 11, go to chapter 12. Next week we're going to finish up chapter 12. Then we'll take a week off for Ash Wednesday before we get into that very difficult chapter of Mark chapter 13. And then after February is done, we will round the corner and go through chapters 14 and 15. And then after Easter, we'll finish with the Easter story. So, just like last week, here's how we're going to do things this week. We'll start with the first reading of the story. And then we'll do a little comparative look at the Gospel of Mark alongside of Matthew, Luke, and John for one of the stories, and alongside of Matthew and Luke for another. We'll look a little bit at the context of where we are in Mark's greater story, and remember that. Then we'll circle back and do a little verse-by-verse close reading before we end up asking, in our second reading, what is this story about? We talked a little bit last week about moving from naivete to complexity to the second naivete, and that's the kind of process we'll follow. If we have time, we're going to add step number 6, where Mark ruins the world, but only if we have time. So, with that, let's start by reading together the New Revised Standard Version of our text. Again, they came to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, he being Jesus, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say, then why did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin?" They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." And that's the end of the first story, the end of chapter 11. So reading on. Then Jesus began to speak to them in parables. "A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower, and he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But those tenants said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours.' So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that Jesus had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. So at this point, I just want you to take a moment, stop the film if you want, and ask yourself, what is this reading about? What is this reading about? Now, obviously, we've got two stories. Each of them would be easily taken by themselves as opposed to a 1-2 punch combination. So one question you can ask yourself is whether these stories seem to have been independent in their origin, or if there's something about one story that helps you understand the other, something about the other story that helps you understand the one. That's what we do when we have two stories. We look for ways that they might inform one another. Now, these are successive stories, stories in sequence, as opposed to the sandwiching technique that we saw last week. So they are told in succession, but there is a little bit of a topical break when Mark changes language at the first verse of chapter 12 and says, he began to speak to them in parables. So you would have a reason to keep them together. You would also have a reason to take them separately. So I'm going to refer to the two stories as the inquiry story, where they come up and inquire Jesus about the authority with which he's working. Remember, he's gone into the temple and disrupted it. And the second, I'm going to call it the tenant parable, because it's a parable about tenants. So what I want to do now is just, you just heard the two stories. Let's compare them with a little side-by-side comparison to the other Gospels. So for example, in the inquiry story, remember it happens the day after Jesus cleansed the temple. So this is a new day. After the cleansing of the temple, Jesus left and went back, and then this story began with them coming into Jerusalem again and coming to the temple again. So it's the day after the cleansing, and the characters are the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. And I want you to notice a word that appeared in the New Revised Standard Version, and it is a fine translation, is when Jesus asked them about John's baptism, whether it's of heavenly or earthly origin. The New Revised Standard Version said that they argued together. Just bear that in mind. We'll compare that in just a moment. So those are three things I want you to see about it. When it happens, who's involved, and then that key word of arguing together. If we look at Matthew's story, likewise, it's the day after the cleansing. So Matthew's similar to Mark in that respect. Only when Matthew tells the story, it's the chief priests and the elders. There's no mention of the scribes. And, like Mark, Matthew uses that word that they argued together. Now look closely at this word, okay? These are the Greek letters. Don't let that throw you off. They look enough like English letters where you could probably make out some sounds here. Die logizomto, okay? That Y-looking thing is like a G, okay? So you got logi. This is an L, kind of crooked looking, a lambda, an L. Dia logizomto. You can hear some words in there that are not far from the English language, right? So dia would be the prefix, kind of like D-I-A is a prefix for us. And when you see that prefix in English words, it usually means something like across or back and forth in some way. But the stem, the root of this word is logizomto, or logizomai would be the better way of putting it. Logo. And you know that that's a biblical term, right? The noun logos means word. It means more than just word, but that's a good way to translate it. The verb lego, which is a related term, means to say or to speak. Very, very common in the Gospels. So a dialogizomto is a dialogue. Dialogue. Just like in English we use the word logos or logi to mean a word or a study or a manifestation of something. So biology is the study of the bios. Theology is the study of the God. Or you could say the Word of God. So what you have here is a word that looks very much like our word dialogue, which means to talk back and forth, right? And we have that term here for how the discussion went with the chief priests and the elders, or the chief priests, scribes, and elders when Jesus asked the question. Now look what Luke does. First of all, for Luke, it's not the day after the cleansing. He's got a line in there after the cleansing that says something like, day after day, Jesus was teaching in the temple. So it's not really the last week for Luke. This story begins with Luke with just kind of an ambiguous one day as he was teaching. So for Luke, it's one day. We're not sure which day. But like Mark, Luke has the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. But look, Luke doesn't use the dialogue word. He still has the same root, but a different prefix. And the prefix is actually the first three letters, which would be like an S-U-N or S-Y-N. Kind of like the word synthesis, S-Y-N. And the prefix sin or sun means together. So as here in their dialogue where they're logging, they're talking across and back and forth, which could conceivably be an argument, here they're talking together. They're wording together. They're having a word with one another. So sun can often be translated just with. So it's a togetherness kind of term. So that's a distinction. Also in Luke, when they're huddling together and the chief priests, scribes, and elders are trying to decide how to respond to Jesus' question, one of their fears is not just that they fear the crowd, but they say out loud, the people will stone us. Remember that, because that word will reappear later on in a couple of ways. Okay? And then there's John. John also has this inquiry story, but for John, it happens just as Jesus is cleansing the temple. It's not the day after. Jesus is storming the temple and doing, disrupting the temple, and they ask him, who gave you the authority to do this? It makes a lot more sense, actually, to plug this right then, right there. But also remember that for John, the cleansing of the temple is not in the last week. It's in the second chapter. It's early on, and if you follow the pattern of John's gospel, it'll look like it's a couple years away from the last week of Jesus' life. In John's gospel, it's not the chief priests, scribes, and elders, or the chief priests and elders, but they're described as the Jews. I think that's a very unfortunate description. It's got an unfortunate history. I think it should be translated the Judeans as opposed to the Jews. And we know that a lot of folks have used that phrase, the Jews, to signify that anybody who's Jewish is guilty of the kind of resistance that Jesus met with these folks. John is referring to the Jewish leadership because sometimes he'll use the phrase the Jews over and against the crowd. But the crowd are Jews also. And the writer John was probably a Jew also. And so it's a very broad phrase that's been really malignly used over the years for as a way of kind of condemning Jewish people in general. Very unfortunate. But that's the phrase that John uses here. It's not the chief priests, scribes, or elders. And in John's gospel, when they ask Jesus about that, Jesus says something very odd that you don't see in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. He says to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up. And that leads to an interesting conversation about, the temple took 46 years to build, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. And then John says, the narrator says, but he was actually talking about the temple of his body, not the physical temple. So just remember the connection of this to the temple, okay? But then, when John says he's talking about the temple of his body being destroyed, what we have there in the 2nd chapter, early on, is a foreshadowing in John's gospel of the crucifixion. And Jesus says, destroy this body, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So now we have a foreshadowing of the resurrection. And John, in case you missed the point, John ends by saying, after he was raised, the disciples remembered these words. So again, a reference to the resurrection itself. So, this story takes a whole different direction in John's gospel than it does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now that's the inquiry part, where they come and ask Jesus a question, and he rebuts them with a question, and they're stumped. Okay, now let's compare the tenant story. And again, we'll start with the Gospel of Mark. It's in chapter 12, and it's part of the inquiry story. And it follows the inquiry story by saying that Jesus says a parable, or says parables to them. And at the end of the story, we're going to circle back, and the them is going to be the chief priests, scribes, and elders. So that's who he's talking to with this parable of the tenants. You remember in that story when we read it, that the owner, the landowner who's gone away, sends one slave, and then another slave, and then another slave, and then finally his son, right? One at a time, slaves. That's going to be something to pay attention to. You remember in that story when the landowner decides to send his son, the son is described as his beloved son. So you hear that term and you think, I think I've heard that before in Mark's gospel, right? And one thing I really want you to notice in Mark's telling this story is that when Jesus asked the question, what do you think the landowner will do, the Lord of the vineyard will do after they've killed his son, Jesus answers the question. He will come and he will, destroy them and take the vineyard and give it to someone else. Pay attention to that because it's different in Matthew. So in Matthew, after they inquire Jesus about his, who gave him the authority to do what he's doing, Matthew actually leads to a different parable first of a father who had two sons. One said, yeah, I'll work in the field and doesn't. The other said, no, I won't and does. And the question is, which of them really did what the father wanted? And then Matthew gets to this story of the parable of the tenants. So it's a little bit different. Whereas Mark's telling talked about the owner sending a slave and then another slave, one at a time. In Matthew, each time he sent, it was slaves, plural. Matthew likes his plurals. And in Matthew, when the son is mentioned, it's not called the beloved son. So, that little flag doesn't go off in your head immediately in Matthew's gospel thinking, oh, that might be a Jesus figure, because it's not using that language. And here's the key difference between Mark and Matthew is that when Jesus asks, what will the Lord of the vineyard do? It's the chief priests and elders who answer, he will destroy those wretches and do away with them and take their land and give it to someone else. It's coming from them. So when you hear that, you might ask yourself at that point, are they right? And then, remember how the end of our reading said the stone that was rejected has returned to become the chief cornerstone. In Matthew, it continues to say, and this stone, whoever falls on this stone will be crushed, and whoever this stone falls on will be crushed. So that cornerstone can become actually quite deadly. You didn't get that in Mark. And in Luke's gospel, it's even different in some ways and similar in others to Mark. It's after the inquiry, but Jesus is no longer talking to the chief priests, scribes, and elders. He turns to the people and is now addressing them. And when Luke tells the story, none of the slaves is killed. They're beaten, they're mistreated, they're sent away empty, they're not treated rightly, but none of them is killed in Luke's story. So suddenly you might think maybe that's not what we thought it was. Dadgummit. And in Luke's story, it is the beloved son. In Luke's story, when Jesus asks, what will the Lord of the vineyard do? Jesus answers the question himself, just like in Mark, but unlike Matthew. And in Luke's story, the cornerstone is also deadly. Okay? That's a little bit of comparison. That's for you in case you want to kind of take this story and just on your own try to see how it plays out in the various Gospels as a way of understanding what it's calling us toward. Okay? Now let's look at a little bit of context for Mark. When we enter into the story in chapter 11, verse 27, it says Jesus entered again into Jerusalem. This will be the third time that Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. You remember he came in the first time on the triumphal entry, as we call it, right? The big parade that brought him into Jerusalem. Went into the temple, looked around, nothing going on, left. The second day, they come again into Jerusalem. That's when he's hungry for figs and curses the fig tree before going into the temple and totally disrupting everything there. Now we're on another day where for the third time they're coming to Jerusalem. We are in the last week on Tuesday. So Jesus entered on Sunday and the parade, on Monday with the cleansing, and today on Tuesday, and he's going to stay in there for quite some time. And he'll be in the temple through the end of chapter 12. So at this point, let's go back to my translation and just look at it verse by verse, and we'll try to fly through some stuff so we can save time at the end to chew on the meaning a little bit. 27, and they came again into Jerusalem, and making his way in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. So not only is Jesus in Jerusalem for the third time, he's going into the temple for the third time. And again, it's the chief priests, scribes, and elders here. That's who we're dealing with in this story. And they were saying to him, in what authority do you do these things, or who gave you this authority to do things? Remember, this is a literal translation, a wooden translation. It hasn't been smoothed out to make it for easy reading. So it's a little awkward to say, in what authority? Ezra Gould argues in his commentary that the gist of that question is, what kind of authority? Where is this authority coming from? Jesus will actually rephrase that question in a very better way in the next verse. So they're asking in what kind of authority is it, and who granted it? And yet Jesus said to them, I will interrogate you one word. Now, that's an odd translation, isn't it? In the New Revised Standard Version, it said something like, I will ask you one question. It literally says one word, logos. That's the word there. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the word logos doesn't strictly have to mean word every time you see it. It can mean a study, it could mean an inquiry, it can be a very widely interpreted term. So Jesus, but if you go with the most common response to it, I will interrogate you one word, and answer to me. and I will also say in what authority I do these things. So I just love Jesus here in this story. I mean, I love Jesus generally, but I really love Jesus here in this story because there is an underlying power dynamic here. And it's the presumption of who's in the position to ask the question, right? You've seen that in kind of melodramatic movies where someone will say, "What are you doing here?" And say, "I'm the one asking the questions here," you know, and it's kind of like King of the Hill over who's in charge of asking questions. That's a real thing. That's a real power dynamic. And for the chief priests, scribes, and elders who have now the aggregate power of numbers coming and they have these titles and they're in the place where they're well known and they exercise their authority, they come to Jesus and they presume that they have the authority to interrogate him. So the word, reason I translate this word, interrogate, it could be translated ask. There are other words for ask. It's almost always used in Mark's gospel in a challenge. So Jesus is coming back to them. Well, I'll interrogate you. And if you answer me, then I'll answer you. And it's a real power play here. But it's going to be more than just a power play. It's actually Jesus is refining the question to see if they're willing to live up to the same questions and criticisms that they are demanding of others. That's a real interesting way of deflating the ego trip of people in power. So again, Jesus says, I will ask and interrogate you one word, one question. You answer this, I'll answer you. And here it is. Was the baptism of John, we're talking about John the Baptist, right? Very, very popular figure, very well known, mentioned in some history books from that time, more than Jesus even, and had an incredibly deep impact on the people of Israel. Was the baptism of John out of heaven or out of humans? Answer me. Now again, this is a little bit of a wooden translation, right? Out of is just really taking a preposition, ek, there, literally. A smooth translation would say, was it authorized by, or did it come from, something like that. But think about what it would say, what it would mean to say that John's baptism came out of heaven. And that would mean then that this is a genuine word of the Lord. Now those of you who were in worship at St. Mark last weekend, you heard Stephen Johnston or someone else read the book of Deuteronomy when the succession of leadership fell from Moses to Joshua, and the whole question was, who will speak a word of the Lord to us? Because the people of Israel tried to go to the mountain, tried to hear God's voice themselves. It was too much for them. They could not handle that truth. And they said, no more of God speaking to us. You speak to us, Moses. And now the question is, when Moses is moving on and Moses is going to die, who's going to be the one who can bring the word to them? And it becomes a real thing to carry the word of the Lord because it can be misused, right? So this is no small thing to say that John's baptism was out of heaven means that this is the word of the Lord. He was a genuine, true prophet. Or was it out of humans? Well, to say that it's out of humans means that it's contrived in some way, and it might be for a relative good, might be well intended, it might not, and it might have the sanctioning of the local governing authorities. It might be a negotiated power. It could be any number of things, but it's not out of heaven. It's out of humans, and so it's a contrivance of some sort for John to have presumed to be speaking the word of the Lord. So that's a real question. And that's the question they should have been asking Jesus, right? Is your authority from heaven or from humans? So Jesus gets the question right, and he asks it to them regarding John. And then we see them turn into what they are. And they were dialoguing, dialogizomai, right? They were dialoguing to each other, saying, if we say out of heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe in him? But if we say out of humans, we fear the crowd. That actually should be translated, they feared the crowd, for they all hold John that he really was a prophet. So, I mean, first of all, they're right. They're right. If they had answered John's baptism was out of heaven, that's exactly what Jesus would have said of them. Why didn't you believe him? They're not stupid. They're evil. Okay, they're not stupid. They're conniving. They're right. And if they had said out of humans, they would have been in deep stuff, because the people gathered around who were witnessing this believed in John. So they're not wrong here. They're right in their equivocating. That's how Ched Myers translates that word dialogizonto, is that it's equivocating, going back and forth. This is not the first time that we've seen a reference to how the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees and elders are reluctant to upset the crowd. In verse 18, they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they didn't, because they were afraid of the crowd. And when they finally do arrest Jesus under the darkness of night in a secret place, he's going to say, day after day I was in the temple, you didn't arrest me there. Why not? So it's very clearly the case that they're having to work undercover because they're afraid of the crowd. Verse 33, and having answered Jesus, they say, we have not known. For some reason, that verb to know, which also could be translated to see, for some reason it typically shows up in the perfect tense. And something peculiar about the verb that I just don't understand, but it's fairly consistent in Mark's gospel. To say we have known or we know something, it's almost always in the perfect tense. And it's awkward to translate it that way. We have not known. But that's how they answer. We don't know. And Jesus says to them, neither do I say to you in what authority I do these things. So you've got that kind of awkward phrase there. But what's happened here is that Jesus has exposed the power game. They are asking this question to discredit Jesus, and Jesus is reflecting that question, which discredits them. And this is the end of the first story. And then we start again. And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a pit for a winepress and built a tower and leased it out to tenant farmers and went abroad. Now, I translated this term as tenant farmers. And the reason being that the prefix is geo, as in geography, as in geological, having to do with the ground. So I wanted to get the word farmer in there because these are folks who work the ground, but they're quite evidently tenants in that they don't own the land on which they're working. So I'm going with the phrase tenant farmers. I think the King James Version called it husbandries or husbandmen, which we typically associated with animal husbandry, so I didn't think that was helpful. This is more of a vineyard with vintners and winery and so forth. So I think this is a fairly good way of thinking about it. These are tenant farmers. And there's a reference here to a song in the book of Isaiah, chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. It's called the Song of the Vineyard. And I want you to be somewhat familiar with that, particularly in verse 2 of that Song of the Vineyard from Isaiah 5. It says, he dug it, cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and hewed out a wine vat in it. Sounds very, very much like the description here. So in some respects, this is an echo of the Song of the Vineyard from Isaiah chapter 5. But listen to how Isaiah continues. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded sour grapes. He expected justice, but found bloodshed. It becomes quite a condemnation in Isaiah. So, if Jesus is telling this parable in a way that is an echo of Isaiah's story, then suddenly you've got, you know that this is not going to go well. It's got all the makings of a beautiful vineyard that is productive and lovely, and it's not going to go well. Okay, let's just move on. Verses 2 and 3. And he sent a servant to the gardeners, or to the tenant farmers in the season, in order that he might take from the tenant farmers from the fruit of the vineyard. And having taken him, they beat and sent him away empty. So, what just happened, right? I mean, up until now, you got the thing you do to build a vineyard and a winery, and of course you work the land and you lease it out to tenant farmers. That seems to be a relatively common practice. We'll think about that again in a moment. And of course, if that is a common practice, then the absentee landlord is entitled to apportion his share, the first share, of the produce that comes, and yet when he sends his servant to collect it, they beat him, send him away empty. That's a radical turn in this story. So how are we reading that? On the one hand, you could say, wow, those tenants are awful, right? And I think that's how Mark is reading this story. But if the story is told in a context of resentment, let's say that the people in Galilee, or the people to whom Mark is writing, or some of the folks in Israel, are resentful of absentee landlords, because this is the real problem in first century Palestine, is that many of the smaller landowners had lost their lands over the years, either through debt, through failed crops, or through land being appropriated by the Roman Empire and then divvied out to some of their favored insiders or something like that. But in the first century, the number of people who were landowners was very small, and that small group of people owned a lot of land, and most of them didn't work the land. They actually owned it from a distance, or else just owned it, but they were not the people who were actually out doing the work in the land. And so most people who had once upon a time been landowners, and that's what the year of Jubilee was supposed to ensure, is that no family was ever left landless for perpetuity. Over time, most people had lost their land. And most of the farmers were tenant farmers or even day laborers. That's even worse, right? They didn't have a regular gig. They just showed up and hoping that someone would hire them for the day. So there was the economy at that time, of the very dependency economy of people who were not landed folk, dependent on the landed folk to hire them and so forth. So there was an enormous amount of resentment between people who worked the land and absentee landowners. So if you tell this story in a context like that, it may be the case that the crowd listening actually sympathizes with the tenants to some extent. In Isaiah chapter 5, right after the Song of the Vineyard, Song of the Vineyard is verses 1 through 7, Isaiah 5:8 says this: "Woe to you who join house to house and add field to field until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live along the midst of the land." Isaiah is criticizing people who aggregate land at the cost of those who are now landless. So in some respects, if we're inclined to hear this as a story of the oppressed lashing out against the oppressor, we might be somewhat sympathetic to the tenant farmers, but it seems that that's not the way Mark is telling this story. So when we ask the question, who's the culprit here, I think the plain reading of Mark's gospel is that the tenant farmers are the culprits. They should have just given the portion of the produce that belonged to the landlord to the servant and let him be on his way. Didn't happen. Turned sour. So he sent again to them another servant. They also struck him on the head, treated him with contempt. And he sent another, and they also killed him, and others. And some they beat, and some they were killing. So it's a lot of repetition going on here. But in some respects, what Mark might be picking up on is also a reputation that Jerusalem has among a lot of the common people. For example, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says at one point, "Therefore I send you prophets, sages, scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some of whom you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that you may come upon all the righteous bloodshed of the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." So there is that reputation that Jerusalem, at least among some, okay, a reputation that Jerusalem was a city that was antagonistic toward those prophets whom God had sent. We want to pay attention to that. So now suddenly you might think, oh, I see the tenant farmers are not the victims of oppression here. They're the folks who reject the prophets, the one whom God has sent. So suddenly we start asking the question whether or not this parable is an allegory. There's a little bit of a difference, right? So a parable tends to have just kind of one main point. An allegory, you can almost say, well, this person fits that person, and this person fits that person, and so forth. It looks like what we might be looking at here is an allegory, and the next verse will really cause us to think that. All right, so this is the verse that really causes commentators, particularly Christian commentators, to read this parable as an allegory. Still, he was having one beloved son. He sent him last to them, saying, "They will revere my son." So the first thing you want to ask is, really? They killed the servant, they killed another servant, they beat a servant, they sent a servant away empty. They've not shown any signs of giving any respect whatsoever. And now you're going to send your beloved son thinking, oh, you know, they'll be good to him. I think they've learned a lesson. That makes this father seem like an unreal figure in some respect. But it's not our story, it's Mark's story. So we'll let him tell it the way he does. But then we see this phrase, right? The beloved son. And this is why we tend to read this story allegorically, is because in Mark's gospel we've seen this phrase before. We saw it at baptism, we saw it at the Mount of Transfiguration, both times a voice out of the heavens, which would be God, declaring Jesus to be my son, the beloved, or my beloved son. Same words here. And that's why we tend to read the story as an allegory, that the absentee landowner is God, the servants who were sent earlier are prophets, and the one who's finally sent is the beloved son, Jesus. Yet those tenant farmers said to one another, "This is the inheritor. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be for us." And having taken him, they killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. I translated the first term inheritor, where most translations say heir. That's a fine translation, but it's the same root as the word inheritance, and I wanted you to be able to see that. Besides this being an incredibly dark and difficult verse that they killed him, threw him out of the vineyard, particularly when you're thinking allegorically about Jesus being killed and thrown out. It also strikes us as being nonsensical, right? Why would they think that if they killed the son, they get to have the land? Most laws don't work that way. There are a lot of commentaries that explain this. I have a deep suspicion that they're just trying to make the world safe for the Bible sometimes. Joaquin Jeremias, who's typically a very, very well-regarded commentator, argues that there were laws that if a landlord were in a distant land, and if he sent his son, they might have the right to assume that the landlord himself is dead. And if they killed the son, then it would be ownerless land that they could claim for themselves. I don't know. I'm just going to say I don't know. I don't know property laws from first century Palestine. That sounds to me like a stretch, but that's how the parable goes. So when you're letting someone else tell the parable, we just go with it. That was their rationale, and they killed the beloved son. Jesus is still talking. Therefore, what will the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenant farmers and lease the vineyard out to others. Now, does that then mean that this is the parable of God's judgment, particularly against Israel? We'll get back to that question in just a moment. Let's finish up though. Then Jesus said, "Did you not read the scripture? A stone which the builders rejected, the same became the head cornerstone. With the Lord it happens, and it is amazing in our eyes." Did you not read that? That's why there's a question mark at the end. So in some respects, there's a resurrection motif going on in this verse, right? The stone that's rejected returns to become the chief cornerstone. And then the story ends by saying, "And they," so we're still talking about the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees. I keep saying that. Chief priests, scribes, and elders were seeking a way to arrest him. And they feared the crowd because they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. And having left him, they went away. So, clearly for Mark, the way Mark lays out the story and the people that Mark has hearing the story and responding to the story here in the end, clearly this is a parable directed against the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Okay? So, having walked through it, having seen the side-by-side and all of that, I probably just threw way too much irrelevant stuff at you, but having heard perhaps in the middle of that some relevant stuff, let me ask you, what is this reading about? What is this reading about? What's the inquiry story about? What is the parable of the tenant farmers about? What is the text about, taking the two together? Okay, let me finish this presentation by telling you my response to this text. And I'm just going to put it out there that I think Mark does not understand the parable. Sorry. So first of all, the popular interpretation of the parable is that it's about the leaders, chief priests, scribes, and elders being unfaithful stewards of God's vineyard, resisting those whom God sent, killing some, even killing God's beloved child. And for that reason, God will come in and destroy them and take the vineyard and lease it to others. And that popular presentation has been read in a number of kind of particular ways. And there's some strength to it for sure. It fits the critique of Jerusalem as a place that mistreats the prophets and kills those who are sent. It fits the description of Jesus being the beloved Son in Mark's Gospel, so you have a good reason for reading it allegorically. Going behind the text, it provides an interesting way of interpreting why God allowed the temple to be destroyed. And maybe that's part of the reason for it, is to explain the destruction of the temple as signifying that it's not that God is no longer faithful, it's that they were resistant to God's rightful share and God's prophets, even God's beloved Son. And it's a popular interpretation because it fits a lot of Christian presumptions about supersessionism, that God has taken the kingdom away from the Jews and given them to the Christians. Not everybody takes it that far, but quite a few people do. Now, there are some problems, however, with that interpretation. One of them, going back to saying, as I was saying earlier, if you're talking to a bunch of peasant people, most of whom have been bereft of land now for several generations, and you're telling this story, their most natural sympathies will lie with the tenant farmers, not an absentee landlord who just shows up demanding his part from a distance. So in some respects, I'm not sure if the allegory would really work for people in first century Palestine. I think this is why I was a little disappointed in Ched Meyer's take on this. I think he dances around with it and avoids the obvious that this allegory doesn't really work for peasant people. And while the allegory does work in many ways, as I mentioned before, the beloved Son, Jerusalem's reputation for mistreating prophets and so forth, it doesn't really fit the overall tenor of Jesus' message. Or if it does, it shapes it in a very different direction than I would expect. And the final problem is, if the Son is killed, and if the response to that killing is to destroy the tenants and to give the vineyard somewhere else, how does that fit with the very next phrase, that the stone that was rejected returned to become the chief cornerstone? They don't seem to have a lot to do with one another, that the return of the stone doesn't seem to be a resolution to the story, because it's already been resolved, because the tenant farmers are now dead. So to me, there's a serious problem with the way Mark is presenting the story. And I think the resolution of this problem actually lies in the Gospel of Matthew. So, remember, one of the distinct differences between Mark's telling and Matthew's telling is that when Jesus asked the question, "What then will the Lord of the vineyard do to these tenants who have just killed his son?" In Matthew's Gospel, it's not Jesus who answers that question, because when Jesus answers it, we all listen and go, "Oh, that's the right answer." In Matthew's Gospel, it's the chief priests and the elders who answer the question. He will kill them with a wretched death, and he will take that vineyard and give it to some others, because they think they're the new recipients here. They don't align themselves with the evil tenants. They answer the question. And because it's coming from the chief priests and the elders in an antagonistic moment with Jesus, we have every right to ask, maybe that's not the right answer. Maybe that's not the way God responds to those who kill the prophets and even kills the beloved Son. Maybe God doesn't come and destroy them and take the vineyard and give it to someone else. And then you ask, well, what would God do? And the answer would be, well, here's how God works. The stone that was rejected returns and becomes the chief cornerstone the stone that was rejected returns to become the chief cornerstone. Now, this is how God works, not a God of vengeance, but a God of resurrection. It's a very, very different approach to evil. So I'm suggesting that Mark received this parable, didn't understand it, presents it in a way that's an allegory, but that Matthew probably presents it more in the way that Jesus intends it. I could be wrong, and I would like not to be fired over that, but I think that's the case here with Mark's Gospel. All right, that's enough. I'll see you Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. Write us if you need the Zoom link. Until then, do well. Thanks.